Thank you for joining us for today's session. I'm your host, Rhonda Alexander with the Build Initiative. We would like to begin with a land acknowledgement from Giovanna Archuleta, Assistant Secretary for the New Mexico Early Childhood Education and Care Department.
I would like to open up this meeting acknowledging our Mother Earth and the land she nurtures us with, the land where our children grow, and the land that provides the food to feed them. When we talk about these resources, we must also acknowledge the lands of our tribal people and the deep spiritual and long-standing relationship of all tribal nations. Today I come from you from Nambe, the land of my ancestors who cared for it and fought for it so that I may one day live and raise my own children on it. A relationship that predates colonial contact by thousands of years. Our ancestors still speak to us and guide us through our songs, ceremonies, and writings. Through removal, trail of tears, long walks, assimilation, and the idea that by removing children would kill a culture. Our ancestors did not give up. Our tribal people are some of the most resilient people in our country, continuing to raise children to be resilient, who are nurtured through language and culture, the language and culture that cannot be removed. We must also acknowledge all other spirits who were forcefully displaced from their homelands and trafficked for labor and production on sacred native land. All of us collectively continue to experience the adversity that caused our ancestors and spirits who continue to hurt from actions done to them. Take a moment to pray these people find the healing and peace to raise their children in a world that has so many opportunities, but most importantly, create coexistence free of violence. Tribal people are praying people. This is where we are all tied. Our grandmothers and mothers continue to pray over us. And as tribal people pray, they pray for people in the north, in the east, in the south, and the west. They pray for infants, children, adults, and elders, and our non-human relations, each with knowledge to share with us. As this conference begins, I hope that each of you are balanced in all directions and take a moment to appreciate what Mother Earth has given to us and how she continues to nurture us in many ways. I invite and encourage you to learn who are the original stewards of the land you live and work on and support those nations and children of those lands. Thank you.
The Build team is excited to present this 20 webinars in 20 days for QRIS 2020. As we explore ideas, possibilities, and learn together about how we might recreate better, more equitable systems with children, families, and early childhood professionals at the center of our efforts. We're grateful to the many individuals who took the time to prepare sessions, generate content, and create ideas to share. We believe the sessions will inspire you to build on these ideas, continue conversations, and innovate back in your own communities and states. We have learned a great deal as we prepared for the virtual events. And one of our lessons is that a virtual event draws a much broader audience than an in-person conference. The Build QRIS conference is designed for early childhood systems leaders at the national, state, territory, tribal, nation, and community levels. As registration rolled in for the event, we discovered many direct service providers, from teachers to center directors and home-based providers, signing up for the sessions. We welcome you to our learning community, and we look forward to hearing your perspective. We encourage you to share your ideas, comments, and questions in the chat box. As you know, we've had to pivot from our in-person conference to a virtual conference, and we would like to say a sincere thank you to our sponsors who made that switch possible. Their support is essential to this event. We have all become familiar with the Zoom platform over the past few months as we have used it to connect with friends, family, community, and colleagues. But we want to point out a few features that may be new to you. First, when the PowerPoint isn't showing, you can choose your view. In the upper right-hand corner, click on the speaker view to see the active speaker, or click on the gallery view to see everyone. Next, we encourage you to provide feedback throughout the session by clicking participants to open the participant list, and then clicking on the icons at the bottom to respond to questions or give us a thumbs up. Presenters may also use this feature to do some quick polling, so be ready. Chat with us. We encourage you to be active participants, so please share your experiences and questions in the chat box. If there are polls in this session, a box will pop up on your screen, and we encourage you to respond. This helps us generate more conversation and enhances our learning together. Now I would like to turn it over to Christine Johnson-Staub to introduce our presenters and launch our session. Christine, take it away.
Thank you, Rhonda. Hi, I'm Christine Johnson-Staub, and I'm from the Center for Law and Social Policy, or CLASP. I'm a senior policy analyst on our child care and early education team. CLASP is a national anti-poverty organization that works across a number of different policy areas that impact people with low incomes and Black people and people in communities of color. Racial equity, dismantling racist policies, and creating anti-racist policies is really central to our work. But it's also a journey we're on and a learning process that we're all engaged in. And because we're continuing to learn every day, I'm very excited for this session and to join our partners to work with and learn from them today. So I am going to turn it over to Oriana Powell to introduce herself, and then Cemeré and Jamie.
Thank you so much, Christine. I want to first ask forgiveness. I had a pretty wild weekend up north in Michigan here, and so I've lost a little bit of my voice. So I just want to thank you all first for being here. My name is Oriana Powell. So sorry about the voice, but I'm the child care organizer, child care movement organizer at Mothering Justice. Mothering Justice is a statewide organization in Michigan that is built around advocacy, grassroots advocacy that comes directly from Black mothers and other mothers of color. We believe that our mothers, mostly women of color in this country, have so much knowledge, so much experience when it comes to navigating their families, navigating the economics around them. That's my daughter, sorry about that. I'm navigating the economics around them. Leilani, sorry, my headphones don't work to my computer. We believe that moms have a very special place in this economy. We do a lot of the work. We do a lot of the work both in the house and outside the home. And with that knowledge and that experience, we believe that moms offer a lot of solution to a lot of our policies and other economic issues. So Mothering Justice does the work of organizing women of color, mothers of color, so that they have not only a seat at the table of policies that directly impact them, but they have a voice that informs those decisions that are being made, and also have the power to actually become decision makers by running for office and being a part of their community development as much as possible. And I'll pass it over to C.
Hi, my name is Cemeré James. I am Senior Vice President of Policy at the National Black Child Development Institute. NBCDI, it's actually our 50th year. We were founded in 1970 with a mission to improve and advance the quality of life for Black children and families through education and advocacy. And I am just honored and humbled to be presenting today with Mothering Justice and with the Center for Law and Social Policy.
Awesome. Well, good afternoon. My name is Jamie Riley. I use he, him pronouns. I am the Director for Racial Equity at the Center for Law and Social Policy, or CLASP, as we like to call ourselves. Without going into it, Christine talked a lot about what we do, but my role really is to ensure that CLASP across our policy and advocacy priorities center racial equity in all aspects of our work, including our partnerships, our advocacy agenda, our internal culture, and our different forms of advocating for equity through policy. And so excited to be here today. And I think I'm actually the first person that gets to talk to you today. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So we thought it was really important as we organized today's experience and dialogue to really start by centering what in how we think about racial equity, and understanding that we all as individuals come from different lived experiences. We all see the world through different lenses, that for this conversation, it was important to try to center and to at least create some common awareness of how we think about this work, particularly at CLASP, but I think I could say there's synergy across the organizations that are here today. So I want to engage you quickly, if you could use the chat box feature and think about your response to what is racial equity. If you were going to give you a personal definition, what would be your definition of racial equity? All right, there we go. Groups of people getting what they need to succeed and thrive. Awesome, thank you for that. Yeah, they all come in now. Equal opportunity and resources. Race is not a significant predictor of outcomes. The elimination of racial disparities, all children and families. Okay, great. Oh, we got them flowing in here now. Okay, so I also would encourage you all, and these are spot on. You know, what I would ask, I'll read a couple more, but I would ask you to do is, as we're going through this, take a look and see what are some of the answers, because I think that one thing that I'm seeing here is the removal as race as a factor to access opportunity and lifelong, the ability to thrive from a lifelong perspective. And so today we're going to give you a little bit more of that. Let's see, giving our families what they need to succeed regardless of race. Exactly. All right, next slide, please. All right, so we wanted to again set a framework, racial equity defined. So the idea of racial equity, like we just said, a lot of you put in there, postulates that race or ideologies about race difference have no direct or indirect impact to how one experiences life, accesses resources, or engages with constructs of power and privilege. And so it removes race as a factor in life. Racial equity centers the role of history and the role of race in creating equities throughout history. And so what it really, it understands and looks at all aspects of how we intersect with different systems, institutions, norms, assumptions, and biases through the idea of race. So we try to evaluate from a race-centered place first. Again, it removes it as a determining factor, and it considers a constructivist epistemological approach. And what that means, I used to be a faculty member, so I had to throw in that theory there, but a constructivist epistemological approach really just says that race and the reality and how we exist in race are all socially constructed, that they only are important because we as a society, as humans, have made them important. And so that also means that the lived experiences of folks that navigate race are also considered real as well. And so it's really removing ourselves from looking at race as a separating entity. Next slide, please. And so it's important when we think about racial equity and then we think about the idea of a framework, if we can disaggregate those two concepts. So a framework is an essential supporting structure of building something. And so it's the foundation, it's the core, it's where everything else is built from. And so it's a basic structure, an underlying system, a concept or text. And so one thing I ask you to think about as we go to the next slide, please, is if we all created systems, policies, institutions that had a foundation of racial equity as that framework, how different would some of the experiences and systems and realities we know very well exist, how they would show up? So when you define racial equity, you put racial equity and framework together, it is defined, or we would define it today as an essential supporting structure that seeks to uncover systemic and institutionalized racialized impacts while creating equitable, sustainable transformation. So it's really about undoing and remedying harm. It's not really about just acknowledging the current harm. It's also the idea of being action-based and thinking about abolition, transformation, liberation, restoration. And so it's really undoing historical harm as well. And so there's this concept, West African concept called Sankofa, which means look back to move forward. It's really the concept of understanding that all of these ideologies and realities have historical context. And so we need to start there as well as start in the current moment. Next slide, please. All right, so there's 10 key assumptions and principles that I'd like to offer you today. And this is really as the person who kind of navigates and works through this at CLASP, on a daily basis and who does this work in other aspects of life. These are 10 assumptions around policy work and just around racial equity I'd engage you to consider and at least think about as we have today's conversation. And so, like I just said, uncover the historical context, understanding the role of history, particularly around policy and how policy has been used to create marginalization for communities of color as well. So only recognizing that we're entering into dialogue that has been counteractive and counterintuitive in supporting racial equity. And so we have to understand the historical context of that. Individually, and this is as agencies or individuals or advocates, it's really about the openness to unlearn. It's the constant and consistent negotiation of assumptions, biased approaches, thoughts, and norms about what is real, what is not real, what is truth, what is not truth, and really being able to unlearn some of those ideologies. The third is adopt an anti-racist lens. Race-specific data, both qualitative and quantitative, should be analyzed and disaggregated. And so it's really about understanding and taking yourself on the journey of not just being non-racist, but understanding what anti-racist looks like and through the practice of policy and service providing as well. This next one is a quote that I like to use all the time. It's about being of and in the community. Representation and connection with grassroots organizations, leaders, and community members is essential. And I know Oriana is going to talk to us a little bit about that, but the idea of that we can't, if we're going to do the racial equity work, there can't be a concept of us and them. It has to be a collective action, which causes relationship building. And it's not going to just happen because an email invitation to engage in a meeting. There has to be some intentionality with that process of building trust. So being of and in the community. Next one is decrease the distance between yourself or your organization and the issue. If we are only learning about the issue through issue briefs or statistical analysis or articles and reports, and we're not really connected to it at the ground, you really, again, are perpetuating inequities and a supremacist ideology. So it's really about removing how close to the issue are you and your organization to be able to make really valid and informed decision making. Next slide, please. The last couple here, assess at the intersections. So we understand that no communities of color are a monolith, that parents, families, and children are all intersected at other social identities, whether it be gender, race, class, religion. And so understanding that intersection really happens at I would say equity happens at the intersection of oppressions. And so we really, instead of just saying Black people, we're looking at the issues related to, or the realities of Black women, Black low-income women, looking really at the intersections of the issue to really understand full impact and opportunity. Discontinue the use of deficit language, so asset framing in other ways. Place the responsibility of correcting systems, not people. A lot of time we're talking about equity issues, we start from a disparities model. So we're talking about the disparities and the impact, instead of talking about where those communities actually have thriving, successful cultural norms and frames that can be used as we're looking to provide solutions and create transformation. Assess and deconstruct systems and structures of power. Another saying I like to say is the metaphorical table should be co-constructed. So it's not about having a seat at the table. It's about building the table together, and that should be a collective process. Center the voices of people of color should never be an afterthought. The narratives and experiences within the community should be a direct guidance to the action that's taken. So it's not so much about, oh, we forgot to include this community, then we need to throw it all away and start again at this point in time, because that community needs to be at the center and core as the ideologies, the realities are being constructed at the same time. And then last but certainly not least, racism and poverty are interconnected. And that's important for us at CLASP. You cannot eradicate socioeconomic concerns without focusing on eradicating racism, because socioeconomic concerns, poverty exists because of racism for communities of color. And so they are interconnected and they have to be looked at in that same way. Next slide, please. So I think that's, yeah, there we go. That was me there. So again, I hope that was helpful to you. And I think that hopefully that will center some of the other things that you hear from the co-presenters today. And I'll definitely be looking out for some questions as you all have them. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. I am excited to carry on the presentation. Oh, I'm not supposed to jump in, I'm supposed to wait for questions.
No, you can jump in, I think. You're good.
Okay.
It's Oriana's turn,
Okay.
and then, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, it's me. I'm like, wait, what's going on here? Okay. Thank you so much for that breakdown and that framework, Jamie. I think that's really particularly helpful for me leading into the conversation that I'm about to have. So I want to start by saying, again, please excuse the voice because it's irritating me in my ears, so it's hard to hear. Excuse me. But I do want to say that a lot of what Jamie had to say is absolutely right and is the basis of what of why Mother and Justice was created. So I said a little bit about us. Don't do that, Leilani. I said a little bit about us in my introduction, but I also want to be very clear that Mothering Justice is a Black woman-led, Black mother-led organization that was founded because our founder, Danielle Atkinson, found herself to be a mother, married, middle class with 6 children. At the time, I think there were only 3, but who was having trouble navigating not only policies, but also everyday relationships with her children's schools, her doctors, all these different opportunities where she felt like her voice was not being heard. And every system that was created was leaving her and her children's opinions and their needs out of any factors that created any decisions or any policies that were created that she would have to learn to navigate. And so she started Mothering Justice so that she could empower other Black women and other moms of color. One second, go downstairs. And other moms of color to one, build community, which is absolutely what Jamie talked about. We need to build community, not only amongst ourselves, but with our allies and other folks who are directly impacted. I think the system of racism, the constructs of race in general have been absolutely detrimental to all of us, no matter your race, no matter your privilege. All of us are suffering and damaged because of that. And that is something that right now, in this time, we're trying to break away from and break down so that we can heal from. Sorry, my daughter's like losing it. But so I think it's important that we acknowledge why the work of hearing from the communities from a policy standpoint is absolutely paramount. I think so often, like Jamie said, folks are hearing from these reports all of its data, all of its numbers, but you don't see the person. All of those numbers represent individuals. They represent families, they represent people. And so when you think of things with from report perspective, you can absolutely disassociate, which is a part of the huge reason why this country, among other countries in this world, is able to stand by and let things like racism exist, let things like sexism exist, because we disassociate. It's not happening to me. I can't feel what's happening. But the most important thing that we've decided to do is absolutely put the humanity in the face of policymakers. That is going to be absolutely the only way that we can actually get policies that are going to be racially equitable. You have to see who is this impacting? How do they have to navigate this system? So one of my favorite quotes is that the people most impacted are the people closest to the problem are closest to the solution, but the furthest away from resources and power. And so we want to put that on its head and absolutely change that. So we talk to mothers all across Michigan. We talk to mothers, we have national programs, so we talk to mothers all across the country to learn from their experience. How are you navigating these waters? How are you learning how to cope? How are different policies impacting you? And as far as childcare goes, we're absolutely talking to childcare providers and other childcare workers to figure out how these systems and these policies that are supposed to be supporting this sector, damaging them and causing a lot of harm. And so for us, we focus in on that first thing is building community amongst each other, having that conversation that allows us to really break down the walls that we hold up in our societies, where we really truly can't connect to one another, so that moms, first and foremost, when we have moms who are in marginalized situations, I think it's that margin really just creates isolation, because you feel outside of the rest of the community. You feel outside of the society because you're always at the margins. And so we want to have to build community at those margins. We have to make sure that moms and other folks who are giving care to our children have a sense of community that they can connect with one another. And that community is grown through real conversation and real relationship building. The next thing that we do with our moms, which is absolutely important, is that we empower those moms to build community and relation with their elected officials. And the first way that we do that is that we absolutely have to teach our moms that our representatives are just that, they're representatives. They got into office by us voting them in. And I think because this system has broken down and created so many layers of confusion when it comes to how do you navigate politics, how do you understand how this works, a lot of folks that are at the margins really struggle to understand that the power in which they have. So after we build collective power, and we build power in our numbers, we build the power to let moms know that you actually make the decisions. We lead our leaders. They're just here to represent us. And if your leader and your representative isn't speaking your language, that's what we have to change. And so we open the space for building relationship, and then also building up those people who are willing to work with us as champions for our issues. So from the very beginning of our issues, the first thing we do, like I said before, is listen to our parents, listen to our leaders. What is it that you need? What is it? Where are you having the problem? And then we turn that listening session into an actual process that gets us to what policies we want to advocate for. But we keep our members engaged and involved and absolutely leading most of this work at every single turn. So meeting and getting to know our elected officials, some of them are actually interested in running for office. So having those conversations, doing skill building around organizing and political, on the political landscape. So from that place, we take organized moms who know that their voice matters to our state officials, to our more local officials, to our national officials, and we build that relationship. With that relationship, they know that they have the power and that they need to absolutely be able to share not only their experience, right? I think a lot of times when you hear folks on the campaign trail talking about, I know a woman in Utah, or I know this and that, like those stories come from organizers. Those stories come from folks who are pulling people together and giving them the platform to share their story. But we know as moms, we have more than just stories. We have the solutions. And so we want to make sure that when moms go into the offices and have conversations with our elected officials, that they know that their solution is going to be much better than whatever office aide can come up with through reports. I know what I'm experiencing and I know what I need so that this doesn't happen to me again. And so we make sure that there's good relationship between our allies, and we make sure that moms learn how to apply pressure to folks who are maybe our opposition. But with that, they can continue to build relationship. The information is absolutely informed by those who will absolutely have to navigate every piece of the policy as it is created once it is into law. And then we always take it a step further, and a lot of our members run for office, whether that be for school officials, things like that, from every level, local, all the way up to federal. Rashida Tlaib is actually one of our mamas. She was actually working with Danielle closely before she ran for office. So Rashida Tlaib is a mother and justice mom, and that's what we want to see. We want to see moms and their experiences and their families in every piece of any type of legislation being created, any policy being thought about, because that is the only way that we really are going to push ourselves out of this place of racial inequity. That we're actually hearing the voices and hearing the experiences of folks who have to navigate all of this terrain without any support. And so Mother and Justice is here to do that support. And I think I know there's a lot of perspectives on this call, whether you are at agencies and other organizations, actual childcare providers. That work has to get organized. We have to come together as one. There has to be community. That's where power will come from. And then we have to get on the same page. So I want to end there. If there's questions, I really can't see it. Please, someone assist me with that. And I'll just open up right now for questions before I close out.
There's a comment from Allison Corrado who says, I love the idea of our systems funding organizers and listening to organizers to understand how to build anti-racist systems. Can you talk a little bit about how Mother and Justice is supported in doing your work and what, where you think the importance is of kind of who your key partners are and being able to do your organizing work?
Yeah, thanks, Christine. Well, honestly, I'll talk about it from my own personal perspective. I'm a mom of a very screaming 3-year-old who's on the porch. And when I actually learned about Mothering Justice, I think I just had her. She was about 6 months old, and someone told me about the Mothering Justice Movement Fellowship, and they said, I think you would be great at this, you should join. So I joined the fellowship. It's a 9-month program that we take our mamas from where they are, and we do organizing, leadership development skills, so that by the time that they get through that program, folks can jump into whatever they see fit. Some people just want to be block club captain. Some people want to run for precinct delegate. Some people just want to show up and learn more about what resources and opportunities are out there for their community. But they get the chance to really experience a lot of these learnings. And a lot of times the stuff that we teach is something people are hearing for the very first time, but it's not being told in a way that keeps them without the knowledge. It keeps them, but it actually empowers them to know that actually this is what it's been, but this is what you can actually change. And so for me, through the fellowship, I learned a lot. More than anything, I gained community. I lost my mom a few years before my daughter was born, and I had no one to really support me. And like I said, it's important that we talk about the relationship building that comes from organizing, because communities are absolutely left hopeless and powerless, because that is exactly what the system is meant to do to us. So it keeps us isolated and separated, and we don't feel like we're ever going to be able to accomplish anything alone. So it's important that we build community amongst our mamas, which is what happened for me. And then later on, after I graduated the fellowship, I learned a lot about organizing. I actually was offered the position to be a child care organizer. But it's important that we say that I did this work because I was actually struggling to afford child care, not because a lot of times I think organizers come into this space from education. There's college degrees for it, there's all this, but I think it has to come from a place where you're coming from the community and you have and then you've been directly impacted from the experience. Every day I struggled to take my daughter to a job that would let me come to work with my daughter, but then as she got older, there was safety issues where I really didn't have anywhere else to take her. I didn't have anyone who could watch her, but I also wanted to be able to continue to do the work that I was doing. And so I came over to Mothering Justice so that I could have more support financially, and also work at a place that understands that mothers still are whole people, right? Just because I think the society wants to tell us that when we have to be caregivers and we have to be full employees at the same time and productive members of society, and we understand that that has to happen simultaneously, and that's almost impossible. But we give space to mothers to be able to show up, to still produce, and to still, I know, baby, to give access, and to still give access to the work. Oh, do you want your blanket? Okay. Is there any other questions? I'm sorry. I really planned on her not being around for this, but it did
That's
not work
okay.
If
those of us who've had kids have been there for sure. No worries. There's some great discussion in the chat box. There's another great thought, but I'm gonna let you go, and we'll come back and circle back to the conversation if we can in a little while.
Thank you.
So, thanks, Oriana. Go ahead, Cemeré.
Thank you.
I may have a special guest toddler jumping in during my presentation as well. So if you just see the door behind me burst wide open, you know who that is. But building on Oriana and Jamie, and I'm going to be leaning a lot on the language that they have provided for us around organizing, around unlearning, that deficit-based language that Jamie challenged us on. But what I'd like to talk about is our interpersonal journeys that we have to go to start to impact and influence systems. So if what you're hearing today really resonates with you, and you start to think about, when am I going to be at the point where I can be a person that feels effective, that feels competent in influencing systems around racial equity? I'm presenting this as a framework to provide yourself as you're thinking about your personal journey in becoming that person who can influence others, who can influence systems, who can really examine the institutions and systems around you and say, here are the changes that I want to make, and be able to influence people to make those changes. A part of that is to look at the research, policies, program designs that you're knowledgeable about, and really examine them and make yourself knowledgeable about how they are perpetuating institutional racism or addressing. And I call that becoming racial equity literate. I use words like literate because nobody thinks that you learn to read overnight. We know that it's a process that is over time, and no one gets upset with children and adults who are learning to read if it takes them time. And so I use that language to help us be gentle with ourselves in our learning processes, but to also hold ourselves accountable to achieving something. And to really taking seriously the process of building knowledge, because becoming literate is a very serious process. And then I use fluent, racial equity fluent, being comfortable and capable of talking to and influence and teaching people around you, challenging them to become racial equity literate. And then how do you become a person who can really fully commit to institutional changes? And in order to do that, you have to have the knowledge, and then you also have to have the commitment to speaking up. And we can go to the next slide. And so just starting with literacy, I'm going to talk about some examples of the way I talk about the way I share with people the types of knowledge that they need in order to be literate, the type of analysis that they need in order to be literate, and just some ways that we can challenge deficit-based language, the ways that we can think about using strengths-based research versus deficit-based research as we're examining policy, because a lot of the, some of the ways that we ground ourselves in policy and develop new policy approaches are looking at research. Both Jamie and Oriana have challenged us to be more community and family focused, ensuring that we're informed by the communities and families that our policies will impact. But we also need to ensure that we're not coupling that work with deficit-based research about those children and families. We've got to do both. So moving into some examples, and I want to acknowledge here that a lot of my references here, or a couple of them, you'll see Dr. Aisha Ray's name on them because I borrowed some of her slides. So I wanted to just acknowledge that and thank her. So 3 significant approaches to Black family research that I think we should be thoughtful about, again, as we're using research to inform policy, and we want to address the ways that policies are perpetuating institutional racism. And a part of that is if some of the ways that research is problematic in informing policy. And so thinking about the research on the strengths of Black families in an ecology that is generally hostile. So again, recognizing institutional racism, recognizing the racist systems that Black families move in and through in their lives, and identifying and having research that really looks at the strength and resilience that they bring in spite of the challenges of oppression. Another way is looking at research on Black Americans has generally focused on perceived problems, differences, and deficiencies relative to white Americans. That's the type of problematic research that you want to just start to identify. And then research on social class position influences, how social class position influences Black families compared to white families. So again, it's all about a comparison and not about strengths, and it puts the gaze on the family and not on institutions and not on systems. And so as you're looking at research, kind of think about what was the motivation and how you would categorize that research. And then as we move to the next slide, I think overall the goal is to ensure that we are not putting that negative deficits-based perspective on the individual, but looking at how systems of oppression have put a weight on individuals. An example would be Black students are more likely than white students to fail in school because they possess deficits that limit their ability to succeed academically. such as lack of motivation and families that do not care about their educational achievement. And I can say that there were many examples of research. When I was studying child and family policy for my master's, there are many examples of this type of research that was driven towards these types of conclusions about Black families. Next slide. And one example I'd like to share and challenge us to think a little bit more about is the 30 million word gap. In this study, it was a study of 42 families, so a very small sample size. 7 were Black, and on public assistance, 7 were low income, and then all of the families that were in more of a comparison group were professional white families. This study alleged that young children living in poverty heard 600 fewer words every day compared with their middle class peers. This is a study that has been cited over 8,000 times and already raised a couple of flaws in the methodology there. The sample size very small, the comparisons across social class and race, which is something that Jamie raised as well, that we have to be cognizant of intersectionality. And then also that there have been many researchers who have tried to replicate the studies and have not substantiated the claim of a 30 million word gap. But because of this, if you think about the way that we're approaching policy, based on this study, it would say that we need policies to fix Black parents to encourage them to speak to their children more, that's a driver of literacy rates, rather than looking at our school systems and how they are failing to support the literacy of Black children. Transitioning to the next slide. Another example of where racial equity is an issue is the way that we talk about and approach policies. And one that I love to point out to people is in the census. And right now, I hope everyone on this call has participated in the census. But we deem certain communities hard to count. Homeless families are hard to count. Families of color are hard to count. Families in rural areas are hard to count. And instead, I use the language historically undercounted communities, because we know that there has been a lack of commitment to count some communities. Communities of color are undercounted because census outreach strategies have been designed to count white middle class families. And so we, again, are taking the blame and the deficits language off of families in that, and recognizing that if there was a commitment to count all families, then we would ensure that our outreach strategies were effective in counting all families, instead of having a one approach meets all families' needs type of approach, and then we miss out on families and we say it's okay because those families were hard to count. Again, we are perpetuating institutional racism. We're perpetuating racial inequities, because for every one child that is not counted, we're losing between $1,300 and $1,600 out of our communities. But we say it's okay because children of color are simply hard to count. And we actually are becoming, over time with each census, we actually are losing ground in counting Black children, or counting children of color in general, not getting better. I'm transitioning to the next slide. And so the perspectives that we want to challenge people to embrace is a strengths perspective that thinks about context. next. And so just summarizing this slide, we want to make sure that we think about the context. We want to make sure that we think about history. And Jamie has really already walked us through that process of ensuring that we think about Sankofa, we think about where we are, what brought us here. And we cannot ignore history when we are approaching policies, when we're designing programs. And moving to the next slide, we'll start to talk more now, focusing on systems failures. Sorry, so wrapping up, we want to focus on systems failures, and we want to think about how families are succeeding in spite of challenges, in spite of oppression. That's taking a more of a strengths-based approach as we move away from a deficit-based approach where we're looking to put the onus on families for the ways that systems are failing them. As you continue in a journey of self-reflection around racial equity, I'll transition into talking about becoming racial equity fluent. And so as you get to a point where you feel confident, and let me say that another reason I use, and we can transition to the next slide, but another reason I use the phrase literate is because we know that you continue reading over time. That once you're literate, it doesn't mean I'm there, I've checked the box, I keep going, but reading becomes a part of who you are, becomes a part of how you develop. And so we all must continue to ensure that we're watching that documentary, reading that article, finding something new. I'm a YouTube junkie, so finding new information on YouTube, making sure that we're continuing to learn new strategies, new ways, new literature around advancing racial equity. But once you're reaching that point where you're literate and feel comfortable in your knowledge, and you can look at a system, look at a policy and say, here's what needs to happen to improve it. Here's what needs to happen to make that system more responsive to families and children of color. Then I would challenge us all to then start to develop a language around racial equity. The first thing I have here is relationship building takes time. It takes time if you think about the first time you heard of a quality rating system or quality rating and improvement system, you weren't the next day able to go to folks and you weren't able to explain what that was. It takes time to build yourself to the point where you're able to effectively explain a new concept, effectively able to have people really get racial equity, have them understand institutional racism. And so I don't want anyone to think, I tried to have these conversations, we tried to have this conversation in my organization and it's just not working, or with these elected officials, it's just not working. You build relationships over time. You build relationships that are prepared, where you're prepared to have tough conversations about race. Those relationships are built over time. Don't give people a pass for the conversation to go on forever before they take action, but give yourself, this is about your interpersonal skills, give yourself the time that it's going to take to build those relationships and to become effective. I encourage folks to use scripts, do your homework the same way that I sat down and prepared to speak with you today. You have to sit down and really prepare for having these conversations so that you can go from fluent to being effective and really convincing people to change systems and to join you in this fight. And then lastly, I ask people not to feel guilty. So hold yourself accountable to sharing your knowledge, but don't tangle yourself in guilt for not speaking up in the past when you weren't informed. There's certainly some ways that that I didn't speak up that I now know that I have to because I've built up this knowledge and this information. Transitioning to the next slide, I'm sharing a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King, just saying, I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia. So I grew up just like with the words of Dr. King really deeply ingrained in me. And this is one that really resonates with this conversation. We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for hateful words and actions of quote unquote bad people, but for the appalling silence of quote unquote good people. So again, this isn't to make anyone feel guilty. It's to say we all have to arm ourselves and to build the knowledge so that we can be the type of people that speak up. And then lastly, transitioning from being fluent to being effective. Being a person who is ready to take action. As the slide is coming up, I'll just share a story. I was doing a presentation very similar to this one recently, and I was very touched just in the discussion. Someone shared, you know, I'm recognizing that it is unjust to be a person doing policy work or implementing programs and you don't understand institutional racism. And that to me like hit the nail on the head, that we have to look, if you're a person who wants to be an example of being effective, look at hiring practices. I've heard folks say, oh, we started on racial equity work, but then that person left our organization. Well, everyone in the organization should be prepared to do this work. Everybody in your organization should be moving that forward. So it should be a part of your hiring practices. It should be a part of your orientation processes. It should be a lunch and learns. Again, as an organization becoming, as you as an individual become effective, you can challenge your organization to become literate and then fluent and then effective. And then the other example that I like to share is again, this hard to count, hard to reach. If we truly believe in racial equity, then we would say that our effective communication strategies reaches everyone, reaches the attended audience, and we wouldn't settle for we don't have enough resources to reach these particular groups. And thank you, Christine. I can take any questions that have come in the chat. I think we're moving to small group discussion, actually.
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute. There are a couple of comments, just appreciating the clarity on the perspective on the 30 million word gap study and some agreement on that. I think it's a perfect example of something we hear. It makes some sort of sense within our own experience, and then we don't look deeper to really understand what the implications or what the actual, you know, whether it's good research or not that actually really represents people's experiences. So it's a great example. And then that goes on to inform policy. So it's so important to ask those questions. We are going to move to small group discussion. So you'll see in the chat box that there are instructions that say that we're moving into breakout rooms for some small group instructions. The breakout rooms are we're going to ask you to, they're going to be 8 to 10 people and you'll have 15 minutes. And we're going to ask you to take turns discussing the questions that are outlined here. And you'll receive, when we're getting close to the end, a 5-minute warning and a 2-minute warning. These are self-facilitated small group discussions. So if there is somebody who is feeling extroverted or just wants to take on the responsibility of keeping track of themes or what people are saying, to report back, but we want this to be a comfortable place for people to talk about their own experiences too. So, so when we come back, we'll have a couple of minutes to share, but don't feel like you have to share your personal revelations or experiences with the larger group. If you do want to, that would be great. Each of us will be in one of the groups, so we may get that ball rolling afterwards. So I think Danielle is going to divide us into small groups now, and the questions for discussion are in the chat box. As people are returning, coming back to the session, does anybody want to offer up either in the chat or by raising your hand some thoughts from your own group?
Hi, this is Neva Bandelo, and I was writing notes, but as we changed back into the group, they did not get captured. So I'm going to do the best for our group, and please anyone who was in it, please come along. There was conversations about community organizing and the necessity to really see who within our communities are those organizers, those grassroots people that can help move these conversations along. We heard from someone who actually provides coaching to coaches, and this sense of articulating racism in a strength-based or anti-racism in a strength-based approach is very refreshing. And also the nervousness in starting this journey and how to respond, which was really important to hear, that authenticity. We heard about the importance of looking at policies and practices, looking at assessment and curriculum, who has, which is usually Eurocentric. I'm trying to think of everything else. Do you have any, Oriana, that I'm leaving out in particular since you were our lead?
No, I think you did a phenomenal job, Neva. Thank you so much. And to the rest of my group, I think that bunch was awesome. I think if anyone else, I know Juanita was in the middle of sharing, or we got disconnected. But I think, like someone just said here, the vulnerability in that place to have that private conversation really was just invaluable. It was just a great experience. But I'll let anyone else share who needs to.
Any others who want to share from that group or from other groups?
Our group talked about having brave conversations, and I love that framework around just that. I think that having brave conversations kind of empowers people, means that they come to the group knowing that they can say some things that might be uncomfortable, but that the group is welcoming it.
Yeah, and I was on group 4, even though I told them I wasn't going to report out, but I will. Cemeré and Oriana did it, so I'll do it as well. So a lot of the same conversations. I think we talked about thinking more intentionally about engaging stakeholders. And so who are we thinking about? We're thinking about who's important to be part of the dialogue. We had a conversation about people who are most closely impacted should be doing the work around these issues. So what does that look like from a recruitment and hiring and training new leaders in this area? Is that a strategy when we think about equity that we could use? Some folks talk about using their voice in spaces where they can advocate based on some of their privilege and trying to push conversations and dialogue, but the self-investigation and using a lot of what Cemeré shared, and that model is definitely key in that process. And then just really at the baseline being open to learning and unlearning, like just recognizing that some folks on our team were new and they're just getting into this. So not even knowing this was even a large conversation to have, and being willing to push themselves to have it.
That's great. In our group, we definitely had some discussion about the relative comfort or discomfort with speaking up, and how to best do that, and how to use what you know to inform policy. And also, I think one of the great metaphors was the idea of, if you're in a pool and one person's splashing, it has a minimal effect, but if everybody is splashing, you're making waves. And so just the importance of everybody weighing in was really a great point. And also, I'll just say that assessment also got raised in our group, and it's a really good example of, something. Child assessment is important, it's critical, it's heavily researched, but we also know, because our research institutions are flawed and our data is flawed, that we have to watch for assessments that whether they are biased, whether they carry bias in them, and be aware of that, and then think about how else do we evaluate what quality is or what learning is, and what are the better ways of doing that? How do we center that around people's actual experiences? So that was a good conversation too. And there was so much more. I will just say there's a couple of other really great comments in the chat. Somebody said, Tammy Saffold said, so glad the comment about the importance of the census is so many people of color that I work with are weary of completing it. which I think is true for many communities who are cautious about completing government forms, and but it's so critical to getting a count, and also critical to, to look at other sources of information and data about experiences. David Sherwood said that candid sharing was invaluable, discussed how to start conversations on racism within the work, not just personally, but with friends and family. Not just personally with friends and family, but within the work. Sorry, I almost misrepresented that. Being brave also requires the willingness to fail along the way. That's definitely true. It's such a process to learn and become better and then do better. There was another conversation in our group that I just want to highlight, because I think it really gives us all permission to be where we are and accountability to continue learning, which is somebody raised that in one group you may feel like you are culturally literate. We were talking about that scale. And in another group you may feel that you are culturally fluent, or that you're equity fluent, using Cemeré's framing, and that you may go back and forth between how you feel about where you stand in that framing, depending on who you're with and where you are and what the context is. And I think that's a great thing to be aware of, and also to encourage us to have the realization that we need to keep learning in some areas, or that we have a responsibility to teach in some areas and to help others learn, and adjusting that expectation of ourselves along the way. I thought that was a really good point. So in this last little bit of our session, I wanted to just talk, it sounds like some of you got started on this conversation about how exactly do we apply what we've been talking about, the frameworks we've been talking about, to specific childcare policies from the opportunities that we have to shape policies. So we just recently, last week, in fact, put out a brief at CLASP that's around anti-racist childcare policies during the COVID pandemic. And I think we can put that link in the chat and share it with you. But what it really made us think about was, we are committed to anti-racist policies. We have a set of principles about how to approach anti-racist policy. What does that mean when we're having conversations about childcare policy specifically during this time? So some of the things that we highlighted in that brief is understanding where funding is going, understanding the need for funding, and where it's not going. So which communities are able to access funding and which aren't. The underlying and really a part of the brief is a history of the structural racism within the childcare system. And part of that is the chronic underfunding of the childcare system that has led to a scarcity mindset, haves and have-nots, tough decision-making about who gets funding and who doesn't. And then some communities having access and some communities not having access. And that's all embedded in the idea that people have to be worthy, or in really racist ideas about who it is who uses childcare assistance and who doesn't. And also a workforce that is predominantly, or at least disproportionately, women of color, and especially Black women, and how that history and that structure is really informing current policy. So some of the areas that we highlighted in that brief around thinking about current childcare policies, and maybe some of this will resonate with you and help you make statements about policy in your state, is understanding where, first of all, fully funding and really infusing public funding into the childcare system so that we can address that scarcity mindset, and so that everyone can benefit from having more resources available. But then also making sure that that funding is going to providers who are providers of color, to workforce that is predominantly people of color, and to families who are in communities that are predominantly Black or people of color. Access issues, which include access to subsidies, but also include things like suspension and expulsion policies that deny access to childcare for especially Black children and especially Black boys, starting at starting in the preschool years. So thinking about what are the supports and what kind of anti-bias training and supports, and what kind of monitoring and accountability do we need to make sure that suspension and expulsion isn't happening, and certainly isn't happening in a disproportionate way. Health and safety, we talk about the health and safety needs, particularly during the pandemic, and particularly again for a workforce that is undercompensated historically. And so we talk about things like access to healthcare, to paid family leave, to medical leave, to availability of PPE. So if you know that, as we do, that Black communities and other communities of color have been disproportionately hit by the pandemic and the economic crisis that's related to it, and we know that our childcare workforce and providers are predominantly people of color, we know that getting resources into hands so that they can protect their own health providers and the health of children and families that are using them is really critical, but also having those job quality elements like the ability to quarantine and be paid by having paid medical leave. So we talk about some of those pieces. And then, especially with this group, I want to highlight some of the discussion that we started to have in the small groups around quality. One of the principles that we really highlight in the paper, which has been talked about both in Jamie's framework and by Oriana and by Cemeré, all three talked about the critical and central principle of parent and provider voices leading the work in childcare. So it all starts there. It all starts with understanding needs. And to do that, we have to go beyond what data is collected. We have to go to communities and listen to communities. We have to co-create tables or go to tables that are created within the community to really understand what parents need and what providers need. We have to be open to listen to what the needs are, and then we have to advocate to meet those needs. And that goes for defining definitions within our policy systems. So that was all a lead up to quality, which is to say, many of us are working or in some way are connected with the quality rating and improvement systems in our states. And those are all based on an assumption about what quality is that is research-based or is developed in other ways. And I worked for many years helping states develop QRIS systems and set standards, so I understand what goes into figuring that out and wanting it to be something that's really going to have an impact. And yet I think it's so critical to recognize two things. One is that what we consider quality may change if we listen to everyone who's impacted by the policy. So if we listen to providers of color and Black providers, and we listen to families of color and what they are looking for and what they consider to be quality, that may change how we define quality in our systems. Secondly, and equally important, is when we define quality in a way that requires resources or requires access to education, we need to ensure that that is available to everyone equitably. And so defining quality in a way that requires degrees, requires other things, has systematically left some providers out, which also means it has left some communities out. And so addressing that need, both by supporting providers with the resources they need to meet quality standards, but also by evaluating whether the standards that we're setting are actually reflective of what children and families need, can alleviate inequities in who has access to quality care and who has access to the resources to create quality care and what that looks like and what that means. So all of that is to say, those are recommendations that we made in our report. And I would just want to, I was hoping we'd have a little more time, so I'm sorry I went on a little bit too long, but if others have suggestions either in the chat or by unmuting for a couple of minutes, we can brainstorm where there are some other policy areas that you're involved in where there's an opportunity to do anti-racist work in the child care field. I'm watching the chat, but feel free to unmute as well. And I'm scanning for hands raised as well. Well, then I think we're going to wrap this up. So what we're going to do is ask you to think about what we've talked about today and write one thing in the chat that you will do to commit to anti-racist childcare policies. So think about what we've talked about today and make a commitment that will move you towards anti-racist policy work. And it doesn't have to be something big, it can be something small, but it should be something concrete that you know, a step that you can take. So if you can put that in the chat, that would be awesome. And while we're doing that, we can move to Danielle to the evaluation. She can walk us through the evaluation.
Awesome. Thank you, Christine. Before you all sign off, I just really encourage you to give us some feedback on today's webinar. There are some poll questions that are probably going to be popping up on your screens, and so please answer those and let us know in the chat box what was useful, significant, or new, and how we can improve the webinar. I would also like to thank our session leaders today for this interesting and informative opportunity. We sincerely appreciated your contributions and the contributions from participants in the chat box as well. Thank you.